The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I have an opening statement. It's an excellent statement, but I am not going to give a statement at this time. I'm going to file it in the record due to the time constraints that our two witnesses have today. And so I will yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts, for his opening statement if he wishes to give one.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just follow your lead. I know that our witnesses are both have scheduling issues on the back end of this, and I just want to share the chairman and my view at the opening, frankly, that not to keep mentioning this, but we can't keep it out of our minds at the same time, that our prayers are with the victims of the shooting and the family that occurred yesterday, and all those that we serve with that suffered trauma from this, and a reminder across the whole country that every day people are suffering from this kind of violence, and they're in our prayers as well. So I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for his comments, and with to add a comment to what he has said. We do a lot of good things. I think this committee and other foreign affairs committees, subcommittees, and those good things almost always are bipartisan. I mean, you can't get more bipartisan than Mr. Keating from Massachusetts, kind of being somewhat of a left of center, and Republican from Texas being a little right of center. We don't even speak the same language, but yet we are very bipartisan in here, all the way through on both sides. And I want to make that statement because you don't hear that much here in Congress. So, without objection, all witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I will ask that each witness please give your presentation to no more than 5 minutes so the members here can ask you questions. I'll introduce each witness and then give them time for their comments. Ambassador Tina, tell me how to pronounce your right name. Kate now, I'm sorry, is the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. In this position, the ambassador manages the provision of more than $5 billion in international security assistance, bilateral transfers on commercial sales of U.S. Origin defense equipment, international security agreements, and implementation of the President's Export Control Reform Initiative. Vice Admiral Joseph Rixey is the Director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. He previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for International Programs and Director for the Navy International Programs Office. I also understand, Admiral Rixey, that you are going to retire. We object to that, and we still need you. But thank you for your long service in the United States Navy and serving the country. Ambassador, we'll start with you. You have 5 minutes for your comments.
Thank you, sir. And let me also express at the top on behalf of the entire State Department and my colleagues, I'm sure Admiral Rixey will also express the same, but our deep sympathy and condolences for those who were impacted by yesterday's shooting. I think that was really startling for all of us, and those of us who are so interactive at the State Department with our colleagues here on the Hill, we feel it very, very deeply. So again, on behalf of the entire State Department, we wish them well, and we hope that they all will have a speedy recovery. So thank you. Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, committee members, I do want to begin today, first of all, by thanking the committee for holding this hearing and for joining us all here today. It's right and it's proper that the Foreign Affairs Committee, and this subcommittee in particular, conduct oversight of U.S. arms transfer policy and procedures, because each of these, in our view, is fundamentally an act of foreign policy. In my testimony today, I will outline why this is the case, and I will walk through the process and the policy considerations by which the United States reaches a decision on when to and when not to offer or authorize the transfer of defense articles and services to a partner nation. I'm joined today, obviously, by Vice Admiral Joseph Rixey, Director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, DSCA, and the partnership between the Departments of State and Defense, and particularly between my Bureau of Political Military Affairs and DSCA, are stronger now than they ever have been, which is really key to our effective decision-making and policy implementation. Admiral Rixey, as you said, will be retiring soon, and I want to take this opportunity to thank him most sincerely, and beg him also to stay, for the outstanding partnership that he and his team have provided to us. In my written testimony for this committee, I provide an outline of how the arms transfer processes work in greater detail, but before you today, I would like to highlight 3 main points. First, as I indicated at the outset, arms transfers constitute an element of foreign policy. We therefore take into account foreign policy considerations as we contemplate each arms transfer or sale, including specifically the appropriateness of the transfer in responding to U.S. and recipient security needs, the degree to which the transfer supports U.S. strategic foreign policy and defense interests through increased access and influence, allied burden sharing, and interoperability, consistency with U.S. interests regarding regional stability, the degree of protection afforded by the recipient company to our sensitive technology, the risk that significant change in the political or security situation of the recipient country could lead to inappropriate end use or transfer, and the likelihood that the recipient would use the arms to commit human rights abuses or serious violations of international humanitarian law, or retransfer the arms to those who would commit such abuses. As a second key point, arms transfers support the U.S. defense industrial base, and they reduce the cost of procurement for our own U.S. military. Purchases made through the foreign military sales, known as the FMS system, often can be combined with our Defense Department orders to reduce unit costs. Beyond this, the U.S. defense industry directly employs over 1.7 million people across our nation. These individuals and the companies they work for represent a key part of American entrepreneurship and innovation, maintaining the United States as the world leader in the defense and aerospace sectors, and helping to ensure that our armed forces sustain their military edge. In authorizing the transfer of defense articles or services, we take these considerations into account as well. For each export, we examine the effect of the proposed transfer on U.S. industry and defense industrial base, the risk of revealing system vulnerabilities and adversely affecting U.S. operational capabilities, and the availability of comparable systems from foreign suppliers. A third key point, the arms transfer process works. The process is designed to review proposed sensitive transfers while balancing a very complex range of policy, industrial, and technological considerations. Even with all of that, the vast majority of sales move through the process quickly and efficiently. In some cases, certain considerations, for example, relating to technology security, human rights, or regional balances of power, may slow or preclude the approval of a transfer. Such cases comprise a very, very small percentage of the overall caseload that we and our partners in DoD manage every day, but they tend to include some of the most high-profile cases. I'm often asked how we can, quote, get to yes faster. As Admiral Rixey will describe, the most significant delays in the FMS system lie in the contracting and the production processes. But on those very rare occasions when a holdup involves the foreign policy part of this review, I will say this: better a lengthy decision process that moves forward at the right time than a hasty process that puts sensitive technology in the wrong hands, ultimately undermining not only our security and foreign policy, but perhaps even our own industrial technological advantage. Of course, there are always areas in which we can improve. We're working to complete the process of export control reform so that we shift jurisdiction over those defense articles and services that do not provide America with a specific technological advantage from the State Department to the Department of Commerce, where the process is a lot easier and faster. This will free up a significant portion of industry from unnecessary red tape and encourage innovation in our defense sector. We're also working with Admiral Rixey to improve the FMS process, including through better educating and coordinating the entire defense security cooperation workforce across both the State Department and the Defense Department. I'll be happy to speak about these and any other initiatives before you today and to answer any questions that you may have about the arms transfer process. But just to conclude these brief remarks and to emphasize one more time, I am glad that this testimony is taking place, and specifically here in this context, because the fact that the House Foreign Affairs Committee has oversight of arms transfers speaks to the essential role that such transfers play in the construct of our foreign policy and the pursuit of our national security interests. Your committee's continued interest and concern is a measure of the policy importance of these issues, and it tells both the American people and the rest of the world, frankly, that such transfers are not something the United States government takes lightly. I look forward to taking your questions and also listening to any of your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Admiral Rixey, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, Ranking Members Keatings, and members of the committee. And before I get started, in light of yesterday's events, I simply want to state thank you for serving. I'm pleased to be here today in my capacity as the Director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, DSCA, to discuss the overall health of the foreign military sales, known as FMS. I am summarizing my written statement and ask that it be submitted for the record. Under the auspices of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, DSCA leads the execution of the security cooperation programs, a wide range of activities enabling a full spectrum of capability the Department seeks to provide its foreign partners. FMS is the government-to-government process through which the U.S. government purchases defense articles, training, and services on behalf of foreign governments authorized in the Arms Export Control Act. FMS is a long-standing security cooperation program that supports partner and regional security, enhances military-to-military cooperation, enables interoperability, and develops and maintains international relationships. Through the FMS process, the U.S. government determines whether or not the sale is of mutual benefit to us and the partner, whether the technology can and will be protected, and whether the transfer is consistent with U.S. conventional arms transfer policy. The FMS system is actually a set of systems in which the Department of State, Department of Defense, and Congress play critical roles. The Department of Defense, in particular, executes a number of different processes, including the management of the FMS case lifecycle, which is overseen by DSCA, technology transfer reviews, overseen by the Defense Technology Security Administration, and the management of the Defense Acquisition and Logistics Systems, overseen by the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and the military departments. This process, or version of it, also serves as well in the DoD Title X Building Partnership Capacity arena, where the process of building a case, validating a requirement, and exercising our U.S. acquisition system to deliver capability is modeled on the FMS system. I want to say clearly that overall the system is performing very well. The United States continues to remain the provider of choice for our international partners, with 1,700 new cases implemented in fiscal year 16 alone. These new cases, combined with adjustments to existing programs, equated to more than $33 billion in sales last year. This included over $25 billion in cases funded by our partner nations' own funds and approximately $8 billion in cases funded by DoD's Title X program or Department of State's appropriations. Most FMS cases move through the process relatively quickly, but some may move more slowly as we engage in deliberate review to ensure that the necessary arms transfer criteria are met. It should be noted that the validations required by the Arms Export Control Act, such as foreign policy or technology transfer reviews, occur regardless whether a sale is conducted via FMS or direct commercial sales. When foreign partners choose FMS, however, they are assured that their procurements are executed with the same level of confidence as ours, and they will be receiving a total package approach that includes associated capabilities such as training, logistics, and maintenance. Though the system overall is performing well, DSCA is working with DoD and interagency partners to continually analyze the FMS process and target areas of improvement to keep the FMS system responsive to partner needs and agile to support foreign policy and national security objectives. Together with our stakeholders, we have developed and are implementing a robust set of initiatives were captured in our 6-year plan, Vision 2020. In addition, we are advancing key reforms directed by the fiscal year 2017 National Defense Authorization Act. Our focus is to improve the quality of the workforce through professionalism, to ensure the right quantity of the workforce is accomplishing our mission, and to build a more effective requirements prioritization system to be responsive to the global combatant commands while managing limited resources. We have a continuous improvement culture and have identified these priorities to address the mandates of the NDAA, to better enable the United States to remain the provider of choice to our foreign partners, providing them with the full spectrum of required capabilities to train for, maintain, and sustain the products they receive through the FMS program. We are also developing options to provide more transparency in the process as it occurs to our FMS customers. The Transparency Initiative was started to facilitate the improvement of the timelines and the quality in the execution of FMS through greater transparency and communication with regard to each step of the process. As I've noted, DSCA plays a key role, but we are only one element of the broader U.S. government system for FMS. My intent today is to comment specifically on DSCA's contribution to this mission, both in terms of the programs we execute and the initiatives we are championing, and at the same time demonstrate the linkages and close coordination between us and the larger FMS enterprise. Distinguished committee members, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to sit before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. The chair is going to recognize members in the order that they appeared, and I will reserve my questions till last. So I will recognize without objection, I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador and Admiral, for your time and your testimony. I want to get into a couple quick questions on the process for FMS, as I'm sure you're well aware. That's what a lot of people want to talk about. Can you outline for me a little bit just how the process could be made a little bit more streamlined when we're talking about just one U.S. competitor that's in there? Is there a place that could be streamlined when there's just one U.S. contractor competing?
Is your microphone on, Admiral? Microphone.
I'm sorry. I submitted 2 slides with my statement. The first is a graphical representation of the Arms Export Control Act. It is really nothing more than a Gantt chart, critical path. There's a grid on it so that if we ever discuss FMS systems or FMS programs, we can be very specific as to where this program resides and how a case is particularly managing and going through a system. The second slide that I provided you is the full spectrum capability slide. At times throughout this testimony, I will be referring back to those slides to explain the process in a little better way. As far as if a country requests a FMS case that goes sole sourced, we will honor that request. And so we will process that through the service acquisition community that will execute that case. I think that's your question. If it's requested by our partner, we will honor that sole source commitment.
So you don't see a place where we're getting in the way there?
No, not at all.
Can you outline for me a little bit, what would be the biggest concerns when you're looking to determine whether something is an inappropriate sale? What would be some of the examples? Or could you give me some specific examples of when you've identified that you're denying a sale because you thought it was inappropriate, to help me understand that process?
So, again, on that Gantt chart, you'll see that it is a graphical representation of the Arms Export Control Act. There are 3 deliberate conversations that we have to have. It's based on the Arms Export Control Act and actually PPD 27. PPD 27, Presidential Policy Decision, has 13 considerations that we must make before we make a sale. I've been that down to 3. The first is it of mutual benefit? The first conversation we have is it of mutual benefit? So we usually ask that question of our combatant commanders and the country team themselves. The second deliberate conversation that we have is the technology. Will the technology be protected? Will they preserve it, or will they have the agreements in place so that they will protect it? And third, The third deliberate conversation is foreign policy. For example, human rights or adherence to international norms. So those are the three conversations we have. The COCOM on mutual benefit and our country team in the embassy. The DITSA under Beth McCormick, who leads that particular tech transfer and tech security and foreign disclosure review. And then, of course, we work with state in terms of the foreign policy review.
And maybe this follow-on will go more to state. Maybe it'll stick with you, Admiral. But
Sure.
how much are you consulting with other intelligence agencies when you're making these determinations as a part of that decision-making process?
The whole interagency process is engaged when we go through that deliberate conversation.
Okay. You've answered all my questions. I appreciate it. It gave me a much better picture of what you're doing there. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Florida. Recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. I couldn't agree more with both the witnesses in their opening statements that this is indeed a major foreign policy decision. Compared to some of the other policy decisions we make as a country, this can indeed have longer-lasting consequences in many instances and have just as many intended and unintended results. So I agree wholeheartedly that these decisions can't be made in a vacuum. And you really did a great job laying out the procedure. So I'm going to just put out two questions, and I know it will take up more of the time, but I'd like to give witnesses the ability between both of you to answer it. And the first one is more specific, the Saudi commitments that were made. Now, if you can just articulate what some of the new commitments are and how they're different from the prior promises that were frankly reneged upon by the king to our country, and indeed how they might entail changes in how they deal with civilian casualties, and maybe giving more assurances the coalition partners follow those same policies and commitments, their coalition partners. And then the second one, if you could, is the fact that I said it's not done in a vacuum. What about our competitors, the other countries that are, selling weapons to countries? We know Russia, China, France, and I think interoperability. You laid all the reasons out why we should be where we are. But if you want to comment on the concerns you might have about how they do this business. So those are the two issues, the Saudi commitments and just your own personal comments on how the other countries pursue this and some of the concerns you have about the way they go about this as well.
Thank you, Congressman. I think we had an opportunity happily earlier this week to brief some of you on this set of issues related to Saudi Arabia. So I got into a little bit more detail there than perhaps I can even here. But I will say this. We clearly believe that there is an interest in providing Saudi Arabia, but also some of the other countries in the Gulf with what they need in order to carry out what we believe is both in our interest and theirs. And that is to counter some very serious threats posed by Iran and some other salient threats that we see in the Gulf region. The President went not that long ago, obviously. We concluded with the Saudis, and the Admiral can speak to this in greater detail even than I can, a large package of arms sales. The rationale behind that in most instances is, in fact, to bolster the Saudi capabilities to do the kinds of things we have asked them to do. The buckets, if you will, or the elements of that package are largely in maritime security, for example, border security, the kinds of things that arguably they really do need and they need to improve by way of capability in order to push back on the threats that they have. It is a large package, obviously. It will have other impacts that we can speak about. But, the concerns that people feel about Saudi and the coalition, Saudi-led coalition's performance in Yemen are real. We share some of those concerns. We have shared that with the Saudi government over time. And they have given us commitments that have now actually, I think, been in the public domain, but a number of commitments that we consider to be serious and credible, all of which are important. For example, adherence to the laws of armed conflict, vetting of targets. I mean,
yeah, we were also assured on personal meetings from the foreign minister of those changes as well. So I hate to interrupt, we're in time, but if either of you want to comment on the second question, you know, what are your concerns about the way some of these other countries do their business? You know, in terms of our own security here, and what's the way they do it. I suspect they don't do it in as thoughtful a way as our process. But if you could take a little time, Mr. Chairman, to just to do that, to enlighten us on what the other countries are doing.
We obviously have those concerns, sir, and I think we try very hard to both monitor and also then to hold accountable the countries that violate those understandings. We belong to a number of different nonproliferation regimes. Missile control technology regime, for example, is one of those. The idea is, again, to try and hold them to certain standards, and when they are not holding to those standards, hold them accountable. I will say that, again, the Americans and American weapon systems remain the weapon systems of choice all over the world. We want to keep it that way. That's why we're trying to balance the technology security aspect of what we do as against the ability of our defense industry and the companies to do their business overseas and to be as effective as they can be in as wide an array of countries.
Yeah, and I think the interoperability issue is clearly an issue too, because
Yes.
once they get these sales and we don't, the tendency will be other sales will follow that, and these countries will have undue influences.
That's right.
On areas we don't want them to have.
Precisely.
All right, well, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask some specific questions about maybe some specific deals or policies. Egypt had a policy there in terms of our sales of weapons to Egypt. Used to be where they would spend, they put 20% down on a piece of military equipment, and then every year after that they'd pay 20%. So after 5 years they'd pay for it, but they would be able to use that weapon system in the meantime. Egypt, as most of us know, on the front lines of the battle against radical Islamic terrorism. They are themselves targets, and I would say that if Egypt falls to a radical regime, the entire Middle East will fall. Now, have we resumed the policy that we had before? Instead of, I understand somewhere along the line a few years ago, it became cash on the barrelhead. You got to pay for that weapon system, all of it, in order on delivery. Which, of course, here we have someone on the front lines. The actual point of the spear of helping us fight radical Islam, and we're changing our policies to make it more difficult for them to have a weapon system. Has that been reversed yet, or is that policy still in place?
Well, I think what you're referring to is cash flow finance.
Yes.
But that is an appropriated account under the Foreign Military Finance. So it's not national funds from Egypt. So it's the state funds that we would provide to Egypt. We used to allow them cash flow finance, which means if we had $1.3 billion coming in a particular year, they could initiate a procurement of significant size because we knew that 1.3 was going to come next year and the following year. So they would have 3 to 4 or 5 years of buying power.
Right.
That was removed. So now that we will not execute a case until the cash is there as finance. So cash on the barrelhead, as you said. That policy is still in place.
So we changed the policy to make it more difficult for Egypt to obtain a weapon system.
We changed the policy.
Okay. Let me just note that, Mr. Chairman, I hope we all are taking note that at a time when radical Islam are murdering people all over the world, bombs are going off all over Egypt, I might say, which is on the front lines, we changed the policy to make it more difficult for Egypt to have the weapons it needed in this struggle. Let me ask you about Pakistan. I remember that a few years ago when we, when our brave military went in and took out Osama bin Laden, that there was that they had to go through all kinds of machinations on what type of equipment, where to go. They took a route to go get Osama bin Laden that was much more dangerous because they were afraid that they might be shot down by the Pakistani Air Force for going into the airspace of Pakistan. What kind of planes would they have been shot down by? Would they have been shot down by American airplanes?
Sir, I mean, it's a little difficult for me to answer what's a largely hypothetical question. I think what you're asking, though, is, you know, what kind of a discussion and what kind of relationship we have with Pakistan and ongoing. Is that what you're?
Well, I'm alluding to the fact that we have our own military understanding that we can't trust them not to shoot down our own people, and we have ended up giving them modern weapon systems, and we continue to do so. Now, that's not your fault. You're running a system and being directed by political decisions. But I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that we need to go on the record here on this part of our government to say that we're not going to be providing weapons to countries like Pakistan that we're afraid will shoot down our own people, and afraid that, and we know they're engaged in terrorism. We know what they've done now. They still hold Dr. Afridi, the man who helped us finger Osama bin Laden, the man who was responsible for slaughtering 3,000 Americans. They still hold him in a dungeon. Mr. Chairman, we should be facilitating our support and our weapon systems to countries like Egypt that are fighting this threat to Western civilization, to all of civilization. And we should make it more difficult, not less difficult, for countries like Pakistan to get their hands on American weapons. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from California. Chair recognizes another member from California, the gentlelady, Ms. Torres, for her questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Just 2 hours north of my colleague on the other side. So thank you, both of you, for being here. Ambassador Kanow, I want to go back to the question that you were answering earlier as it relates to Saudi Arabia. So President Trump recently announced that we had reached a $110 billion arm deal with Saudi Arabia. Now, I know that there's some questions about, you know, is that really $110 billion? So we're not going to go through that today, but what are the conditions that you mentioned? What are those conditions that were placed on those weapons? You said that it was on open source. I have not seen it, so I'd like some information.
I think some of it's been reported in the press. In fact, I think this morning there was a piece on the issue. I would not call them conditions, just to be clear. I want to sort of, again, give the understanding of this is a dialogue that we have been having with the Saudi government, and it's an important dialogue. I think they themselves recognize that some of the elements of their performance in Yemen have been problematic. They would like to improve those. We need to help them improve that performance. The way, again, that we would hope to do that, one of the things that we recently notified to Congress is a $750 million training package for their Air Force. The idea behind that is very much to provide training on the law of armed conflict, to give them experience with targeting and vetting of targets, the kinds of things that, again, arguably any military, but certainly in a combat situation, you would want to have them be more proficient at.
More proficient at targeting, so they're don't have so many civilian casualties?
That's correct, specifically to try and avoid civilian casualties. And that's important, you know, from our standpoint, from the U.S. government standpoint, from theirs, I think, as well, and increasingly they acknowledge that. So again, I don't want to call it conditions. What I want to say is they've made commitments. I think those commitments are important. And the idea here is, again, to help them do some of that, because in our view, it's better to engage and then to give them that assistance than it is to simply stand back. And because the situation in Yemen is very, very challenging. The Saudis face a number of threats on their border with Yemen. They also face a number of threats that emanate from the Houthis, who, clearly are being empowered by.
You also talked about monitoring and holding them accountable. So I want to ask you about the end-use monitoring. What is the process for making sure that arms don't end up in the wrong hands? Do you have the necessary resources, database, and the personnel to carry out effective end-use monitoring?
Thank you for the question. The State Department has a program that it utilizes for end-use monitoring, but that is also amplified or supplemented by other programs at DOD and so forth. So it's not simply a function of what the State Department does. We have a Blue Lantern program, it's called, that we utilize to ensure that there are ample checks, especially on the most sensitive weapon systems that we provide to some of our partners. We utilize some of our folks overseas in our embassies to do some of those checking. Sometimes it's via the
I
defense.
have very limited time. Maybe we can follow up if there is some database
Absolutely happy to
somewhere
do
where you have, where those weapons have fallen into the wrong hands. What have you done to either get them back or destroy them? Let's talk about Mexico. I have been very concerned about the illegal trafficking of arms into Mexico. A lot of these arms are ending up in the wrong hands. Gun traffickers and violent criminals, narco traffickers. Given the widespread problems with corruption in Mexico, should we also be concerned about what is happening with guns that we sell into Mexico? How do we know we're selling to the right people?
Well, again, and without getting into it too much here and offering up a specific briefing if you'd like it on some of those issues, I think we look very carefully at the end users who receive some of the weapons that we approve for sale.
Specifically, the corrupt police and military units.
We look at the end-use recipients in any arms sale that we do, especially if it comes through the State Department. And, there are some sales, obviously, that will eventually move, again, outside of our realm. But to the extent that it comes through because it is of a quality or a quantity that moves through the State Department for approvals, we absolutely look.
What happens when we find out, as in the state of Guerrero, that these weapons are ending up in the hands of narco traffickers? What happens?
Congresswoman, I would defer you probably to a more detailed briefing on all of the particularities of what we do with regard to Mexico, if that's all right, because I think there's a lot to talk about there.
I ran out of time, so thank you.
Sure.
I thank the gentlelady from California and for her line of questioning. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, Admiral, great to see you. Ambassador, I want to continue the conversation that we had, I think it was last week, regarding the Saudi Arabian arms deal and the other side of the ledger, so to speak. So it might be a little bit off topic, but I think it's instructional. So the context is that I'm concerned about how much the export of Wahhabism was part of the deal, as you'll recall. And so just to set the context, by 2013, 75% of North American Islamic centers relied on Wahhabi preachers who promote anti-Western ideas in person and online through sermons and through Saudi-produced literature. And when we think since 1979, Saudi Arabia is engaged in a fairly persistent campaign of exporting that ideology throughout the world, spending about $4 billion annually on mosques, madrasas, preachers, students, and textbooks. I'm interested in their sincerity, I guess, and how we monitor what our metrics are in monitoring their efficacy, to adhering to their commitments. And so to further set the context, despite assurances that it would reform its educational curriculum by 2008, so this goes back nearly a decade, let me just read some excerpts of current textbooks. A 12th grade textbook professes that treachery, betrayal, and the denunciation of covenants are among the attributes of Jews. An 11th grade textbook teaches that cosmopolitan universities in the Middle East, such as the American universities in Beirut and Cairo, are examples of a modern-day crusade by Christians against Islam. And a 10th grade textbook on jurisprudence suggests that the most important debate about homosexuals is how best to execute them, whereas ISIS itself has used these textbooks issued by Saudi Arabia, their Ministry of Education, in its schools that it controls in Iraq and Syria. To the best of your ability in this setting, can you tell me who in the department, is there one person, is there a portion of the department, is there a crew that is going to monitor the efficacy of their pledge, so to speak? I understand in talking to the Secretary yesterday that they have pledged to change the textbooks and supply their organizations with those textbooks, and also pull back current textbooks. That's what I understand, right, in this new Global Center for Combating Extremist Ideology. But I want to know, because we've been promised before, and we are tired of helping this sometimes ally when they don't seem to be really doing things in what's the United States' best interest. And if we're going to sell them things that they want and that we want them to have, they darn well ought to uphold their end of the deal. But unfortunately, while I love the Reagan doctrine of trust but verify, in this instance, I prefer verify and then trust. So what can you tell me about who's going to be monitoring that and how we're going to gauge their efficacy and what the penalties are for failure?
Sir, thanks for the question. I will say that in the first instance, and of course these issues that you've mentioned I think are of concern to us just like they're of concern to you. But I will tell you that you know, in almost every instance, the people on the ground that we have there are the ones that are the closest to this, and they are the ones that monitor it. So our folks in our embassy there are the ones that are responsible for looking at, you know, whether the Saudis live up to the commitments, again, the promises that they have made. With regard to, you know, the State Department at large, we have a Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs that, you know, again, concerns itself with these issues specifically. We also have public affairs people who look at this, and the whole question of the promulgation of extremism through social media, through other means, these are the kinds of things that we preoccupy ourselves with.
Do we literally have someone in Saudi Arabia that's going to be at the receiving dock checking in X amount or tons or skids, pallets, what have you, of old textbooks to prove that they either came back, or do we have someone in the United States that is working with the Department of State to visit these places where the textbooks were issued to see the new ones come and the old one go? Are we taking the Saudis' word for it? Because apparently we did since 2008, and you can see what we've gotten, which is very little. As a matter of fact, it's gone the other direction, in my opinion. How are we verifying it specifically? And if you don't know and you got to get back to me later, I accept that, but I want to know the answer to that question.
Understood, sir, and I know I could not tell you sitting here, you know, whether we have an individual who is doing something like that, but I'm happy to get back to you with an answer.
All right. I think that we are all interested in that answer, and I think it's important to our national security and moving forward with this deal, as well, when the answer, with the Chairman's indulgence, the consequences to the adherence of this agreement for failure to live up to their commitment. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for his line of questioning. Without objection, we have with us also Mr. Liu from California, not a member of the subcommittee, but a member of Foreign Affairs. The Chair will recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for letting me participate in this hearing. And thank you, Ambassador Caetano and Admiral Risky, for your public service. We've had prior meetings on Saudi Arabia, so I'd like to ask some questions for the record. As you know, the U.S. Has been assisting Saudi Arabia in its war in Yemen. I don't have a problem with helping our ally Saudi Arabia, but many members of Congress on a bipartisan, bicameral basis do have a significant problem when the Saudi-led military coalition is committing war crimes in Yemen. I served on active duty in the Air Force. I am aware that in a fog of war, you can make mistakes, maybe 3, 4, 5 errant airstrikes. I get that. But we're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens. Reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the UN have documented over 70 unlawful airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition, and this is as of last year. Who knows what has done since then? And these are airstrikes nowhere near military targets. It freaked out our State Department so much that last year our State Department's lawyers initiated a review to see if U.S. personnel or others would be liable for aiding and abetting war crimes. The State Department stopped a sale of precision-guided munitions. The State Department this year has reversed. So I would like to know what conditions have changed from basically last November to now that caused that reversal.
As you pointed out, Congressman, I think this has been an ongoing evaluation. In other words, and as I said at the outset of my testimony, it's always a balance between the national security interests that we face and our allies face as against other considerations, many of which you just laid out, I think, very coherently. With respect to Saudi and the coalition-led effort in Yemen, I think, again, the Saudis themselves have recognized that some of the aspects of how they have pursued that campaign are problematic. I think over time, their awareness of that has grown. I think their willingness and their ability to address some of those issues has grown. We've seen that both in the commitments they're willing to make to us, as well as, again, in their willingness to accept some of the assistance that we can provide in order to help them do the things that arguably would improve their performance. Again, as I said, they need to fully, and they have, commit to the following the laws of armed conflict. They need to improve their vetting process for targeting and doing the kinds of things that we all know that need to be done, especially those of us who have done this kind of work previously. They need to be much more careful with their rules of engagement. These are the kinds of things they have
the Saudis made those commitments to the United States in writing?
They have made commitments to us that we have outlined for you, and we will.
Can you give the committee the commitments they have made?
We can definitely walk you through those commitments, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to now shift to Qatar. As you know, last week, the President of the United States, through a series of tweets, accused Qatar of funding terrorism. The President essentially supported the blockade of Qatar led by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations. I'm also reading reports that the United States just agreed to sell Qatar $12 billion worth of weapons, airplanes. Is that true that we're selling them $12 billion worth of fighter jets?
The fighter jet sale has been an ongoing deliberation and consideration for quite a while. Yes, the contract has just been signed for the sale.
Right. And I don't mean to be facetious with this, but does the President know that?
I believe so.
Okay. How do you square that sale with what the President has been saying about Qatar, since you said arms sales are an element of foreign policy?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this goes back to the consideration of the wider array of foreign policy issues as regards the Gulf more broadly. It's not simply a question of the things that we concern ourselves with regard to extremism and so forth. Qatar needs to do some more things. The President, Secretary, has made that clear, and we've made that clear to the Qataris. By the same token, the Qataris and the Gulf countries as a whole face certain threats from Iran, from other sources, but primarily from Iran, that they need to address through means that we can assist them with. These fighter sales are designed to address those kinds of threats. So I think you can easily, understand why we have to do multiple things at the same time.
Right. So thank you. So I don't take a position on this because I need to find out more about it. My only point is that it is very confusing to world leaders, the members of Congress, when the Trump administration does two exactly opposite things. And it's my hope that as the administration grows and learns, that the administration stops doing that. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes another gentleman from California, Colonel Cook, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ambassador, it's good to see you again. You're spending far too much time here. This very, very complicated business that we're talking about. I'm a historian. Go back. You read about Roosevelt and Churchill and who they were supporting in World War II. Sometimes the lines between enemy and friend was very, very complicated. How you could support the Soviets, some of the things that they did under the Stalin regime, and yet we're saying them how much gear. You can go on and on and on. And I think a lot of these things weigh into the equation of who is your enemy this week, and very, very complicated. I do want to talk about the NATO arena and the dependence of many of our allies, the Eastern European, quite frankly, on Soviet-style equipment, both armor and air, that we have not weaned them off. Maybe that's a bad phrase. But because of parts, because of systems, they still have to go back to the new Russia for those things that they had for years. And until they become a total member of NATO in terms of our military equipment and everything else, I think it diminishes their capability as a true ally. And if you could address that question right now, because it doesn't seem like a big priority, and yet countries there, they've been with us and everything else, but we expect them to come to the fight when and if the Russians come across, in such as the RAND study that was envisioned.
Right. Thank you, sir, for the question. I would, first of all, just reassert our deep commitment to our NATO partners, as well as to our partners that are not necessarily members of NATO, but who are allies of ours and friends that we work with extensively. And in a number of cases, we obviously provide either assistance to them, grant assistance, and sometimes in that form, or in other forms. Interoperability, as you've indicated, is a huge, big issue for us. I highlighted it as one of the factors as, that we take into consideration when we make these decisions. I can't emphasize enough how much work we do with a number of our European partners, both within NATO and outside NATO, to ensure, again, that what you're talking about precisely takes place, that their weapon systems are modernized, that they are interoperable with ours, and to the extent that, again, that we need to provide assistance for them to do it, that we give them that.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when we criticize our NATO partners for not meeting their 2%, I think if we're going to put all this pressure on them, and the fact that we're going to come, to their aid if they're attacked, I think we've got to have NATO standards applied to foreign military sales, at least from my perspective. Other countries, obviously Saudi Arabia, some of the others, it gets dicey because of some of the political considerations. Egypt, I thought we're a bit heavy-handed. I know that still talking about the Morsi government and everything like that, and the change by El-Sisi, but of course they did the same thing, and they went right back to buying Russian military equipment because of what happened. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, we have to take that variable into consideration. And we can argue all day about Saudi Arabia and Egypt and everything else, but NATO, we cannot criticize them if they're having a tough time meeting the 2%, and then we're not going to ensure that we do something to make sure that that is streamlined. Admiral, would you comment on the short time I have left?
Well, we'll honor any letter of request for capability. So I am seeing on my travels a desire to move away from Russian equipment into NATO standard type equipment. So we are prepared to execute if requested.
Okay. I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from California, Colonel Cook. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the members of the panel for being here. Generally, Mr. Chairman, when I'm asked a series of questions, there's an answer that I'm driving at. That's not the case today. Understanding the importance of what you all do, of what FFMS does, and what the DSCA does, our office publicly stated a policy that we think that this nation should adhere to very early after being elected, and that is first to seek peace and stability in the world, and second, not to arm people who might later find themselves using those weapons against the United States or our allies. There are literally dozens and dozens of nations, if you cover the gamut from main battle tanks to small arms, to whom we supply arms, and I don't necessarily object to that on its face. In fact, I think in many instances it's important to do. But I would ask you both, and this is a tough question, if you were forced to sort of predict a horrible worst-case scenario where U.S. weaponry was turned on U.S. forces or our allies, in what nation that we currently sell weapons to might that occur? Because the answer can't be, oh, it could never happen. I'll tell you, and I know I'm burning my own time here. I grew up watching terror movements, watching government upheaval, where the foreign fighters were armed with Soviet-style weaponry, and it's galled me for the last decade as we see ISIS and AQAP and other elements in Humvees like the one I drove in, with rifles like the one I carried, firing weapon systems like the ones that our soldiers operated. It strikes me as a bad outcome. So where might we see that again? And then I'll give you a redemption clause, and how might we avoid that?
I think it's a really important question, frankly, and I also think that it's a highly sensitive question. In other words, how do you gauge that? You're asking a very difficult question to kind of get at. I would say, at least when I think about it, and given the time that I've been doing this job, I worry perhaps a little bit less about some of the existing technology and what we've already provided. What I think about is the cutting-edge technology, the things that arguably, anyway, we have to be super careful about when we provide to other nations. And these are really open questions. I mean, we have to sit there and really think about, do we provide certain kinds of technology to certain partners, given some of our concerns, given the question as to whether those technologies will be adequately protected? And we don't take that lightly. I can just tell you. I mean,
I'm going to interrupt, and I'm not doing it to be rude.
No.
It's a real hard question given the professional nature of your individual responsibilities. And I don't want to get anybody in trouble here. There's two ways this could happen, and maybe this will help you. It could happen because the nation state to whom we sold the weapons turns on us, or it could happen as it did in Iraq because the nation state to whom we provided the weapons with the best of intentions abandoned those weapons and they fell into the hands of people who sought to do us and our allies harm.
Yes.
Where might that be a possibility?
I mean, you've highlighted places where, in theory, that is possible. And there are places across the globe where we have, again, provided things, and you cannot always predict what will happen with regard to a government stability or whether the next government will somehow find it in their interest to somehow do something against our interests. But I worry a little bit less about that with respect to the things already provided. I am now looking forward at the question of, emerging technologies. How do we control for some of that in a very important environment in which we want American companies to have the ability to sell, and yet we also want to protect those technologies and not have them turned against our own forces? These are salient questions.
Admiral Rixey.
Well, I certainly don't want to speculate in this open forum, so if you will allow me, I'll take that back to the Pentagon and get you a classified brief or something of that nature. Thank you.
I'd be delighted. I anticipate that you'll proactively reach out to my office. I look forward to it. Thank you. I'd yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here. Ambassador, just for way of background, how long have you been in your current position, just so I know?
I've been in the principal deputy slot since February of last year, so February of 2016.
Okay, and what were you doing just before that?
I was the State Department coordinator for counterterrorism.
Okay. Were you involved in all, because I just have some questions about the FMS-related transaction between the United States and Iran. Were you involved in that?
No,
Would you be able to answer any questions about that?
probably not in this setting.
Well, let me try.
Sure.
When was the United States claim against Iran, our claims against Iran, I'm sorry, when did the United States stop disputing our claims against Iran?
Again, sir, just because I think this addresses a broader set of issues than I am necessarily responsible for in my portfolio at the State Department, I'd offer, again, a briefing, if you'd like it, on those specific issues.
Okay, because for decades, the United States was disputing that we owed Iran money for the sale. Do you know when we stopped disputing that we owe, stopped disputing whether we owed that money?
Sir, I don't have the history of all that in front of me right this minute, so no, I would prefer to get back to you on the specifics.
Okay. Do you know why we paid in cash?
Again, this goes a little bit beyond my portfolio, so I really would prefer to give you a more detailed answer.
You would be able to answer these questions, though, in another setting?
We will obviously provide you any information we can.
And you'd be able to bring someone to that setting who'd be able to answer what you might not be able to answer?
We will do that.
Do you know why the payment was made at the same time as the release of the American hostages?
Sir, I can't answer, I think, any differently than I already have.
I guess procedurally, is there anything the way we handled this entire exchange over the course of decades that you think the United States can learn a lesson and handle it better going forward?
Again, given the fact that we're not addressing in great detail the way that the issues unfolded, I think it would be probably better to discuss that in a briefing.
There was a lot of concern here in Congress over many aspects of that exchange. Historically speaking, when it happened, Iran was they were canceling orders, and we ended up, the United States had parts that we were in the process of putting together. Iran takes over our embassy, and everything that happens there at that point in time, you can make an argument of whether or not we would have owed them anything then. But then there are these disputes over the course of the years ahead to be settled out in court or out of court, both the United States against Iran and Iran against the United States. And we were disputing whether or not we had owed this money to Iran. Yet, what appears to me as a member of Congress, and I know for many of my colleagues and for much of the American public, it seemed a bit odd that a position that the United States had for decades, that out of nowhere, we see the United States making a payment for the full principaled amount, a generous interest amount, and it had to be delivered on a cash pallet to the Iranians at the same exact time as the Iranians releasing American prisoners, and it was the position of the administration that that was a coincidence, and that one thing had absolutely nothing to do with the other. And I'd be really interested in getting filled in on if there's another 99% of the story that we're not familiar with. I'd love to be briefed up on it, but without that information, I find it incredibly hard to believe that that was anything other than a ransom payment. And I find it hard to believe that I'd be able to take the position that it was a coincidence, but also as it relates to our policies, lessons learned, our policies going forward. I don't know whether or not we even had owed the money, and that was a whole other dispute that was consistent. I would say my position was consistent with U.S. position for decades. So I certainly would appreciate that, Chairman, if we would have that opportunity to fill in the gaps that still exist. I yield back.
I appreciate the questions from the gentleman from New York and the gentleman from Virginia. I intend to figure out a way that we can have a classified briefing from y'all on the issues raised by the gentleman from New York and Virginia and gentleman from California as well. I recognize myself for a line of questions. We're all aware of the Turkish security detail that assaulted peaceful protesters on American soil and tried to prevent them from exercising constitutional rights of the right to assemble and to free speech. And I am still mad about that. I think other members of Congress are as well. The U.S. has a plan to sell small arms to security details like the Turkish goons that assaulted Americans. The chairman has written a letter to Secretary Tillerson asking to stop that sale until this is resolved about the assault. Where are we on that, Ambassador?
Sir, thank you for the question. I think you've expressed concerns. We have some similar concerns that we expressed directly to our Turkish friends and colleagues. But this sale is one that obviously is going to have to be looked at and reviewed. It's still in the process of review, given the fact that now the law enforcement process is in play. Rather than sort of give you an end state, I would like to just come back to you soon and give you an update on where we are with it. But it is still in review. It has not.
You understand, as oversight on this issue, members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, through the chairman, have said suspend those sales till this is resolved, and the folks that committed these crimes against Americans and on American soil is resolved. I think that's atrocious that that would ever occur. So that is our position, and we hope that you will suspend those sales until this is done. This whole concept of sales to foreign countries, hopefully folks that are friendly to us, is It's complicated because the idea that if we don't sell to country X, then they're going to go buy from the Russians, the Chinese, whoever they can get these weapon systems from. It's a political issue, but it's also a security issue for the U.S. To have partners that look to us rather than look to the Russians or the Chinese. I understand that. Let's talk about Lebanon. We are in the process of selling weapons to Lebanon. Reports are the Lebanese government gives those small arms to Hezbollah, a terrorist group. Where are we on that? How do we know that Lebanon, those arms don't end up in the possession of Hezbollah, a terrorist group in Lebanon and now in other countries as well? Ambassador or Admiral, either one of you. How do we know that's not going to happen?
Thank you again for the question. So we are very resolute in supporting the Lebanese armed forces. Those armed forces we regard as the most important guarantor, if you will, of Lebanese sovereignty and the ability of Lebanon as a country to maintain its integrity. We consider that very important with regard to what's going on in the region now, given the threat of ISIS or Daesh, given the threat of Iran extending its arc of influence through.
I get that. How do we know they don't end up in the
We are
possession of
watching
Hezbollah?
very, very carefully, extremely carefully, and we are confident thus far that no weapons have been transferred from the Lebanese government or the Lebanese armed forces into the hands of those who should not get it, including Hezbollah.
Do you want to comment, Admiral?
Oh, sir, we would, of course, execute our Golden Century program and use monitoring in that country to ensure that that does not happen.
I want to turn to Pakistan. We've been having the issue with Pakistan, whether they're loyal or playing us for years on the issue of aid to Pakistan and sales to Pakistan. When, as mentioned by the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, when we went in to get Osama bin Laden, we were concerned about the Pakistanis scrambling F-16s that we made and sold to the Pakistanis so that they wouldn't shoot down Americans who were doing the job of taking out this terrorist. That I personally think Pakistan plays the United States because of they turn to China if we don't help them. I understand all that. They have nuclear weapons, and we want to have a relationship with them so that they don't look to China. I get all that. But are we doing anything different on sales to Pakistan to make sure those sales of whatever it is aren't used against us directly or used against us indirectly because of the military helping the Taliban in Afghanistan, where we have our troops, and those weapons could be used against the United States? Are we doing anything different to make sure that doesn't happen? Or are we still using the same formula?
No, I mean, I think what we apply to Pakistan is what we apply to a number of our partner countries, but with Pakistan, we have a robust end-use monitoring program, extremely robust, to ensure that the items that we provide for them are used appropriately and within the boundaries of what we have asked them to accomplish. We, as you say, regard Pakistan as an important partner on counterterrorism issues. They will be essential in bringing the Afghan Taliban to the table for peace talks. There are a number of things where we need their cooperation and their assistance. And we do want to help them on the counterterrorism front. But on the other hand, again, we have very big concerns that we continuously front with them on support for Haqqani, on support for other things. This has been made clear to the Pakistani government at the highest levels.
Admiral, you don't want to comment?
I defer to state.
All right, I'm out of time. I will mention to the subcommittee and to the witnesses, I appreciate y'all's being here. We'll figure out a way to have a classified briefing because we've gone about halfway on the questions that we're asking. Many members of Congress want a bottom line answer to the questions that they ask about the different countries during their questioning here in open forum. So we will work on that. I thank both of you for being here. I know you all have time constraints, and just making sure there's not anybody else here. The subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you very much. Thank the members for being here. Thank you. see if we can figure something out. You don't have to.